Hello, welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Raby, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below. And I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and other issues related to those issues. I want to welcome you to this edition of Sundays with the Rabyd Atheist. My simple design is to give you something better than going to church, which isn't all that hard. Today I want to have a very, Sundays with the Rabyd Atheist are going to be very much me talking about issues, usually related to deconversion or Christianity, effect on psychology, sociology, that sort of thing. I want to have a little bit more of a freewheeling discussion about things and kind of just set the tone and have the discussion in the comments and whatever. But I want to talk about sin. Commenter, let's see, 1cc something, commented about, under one of my arguments for the existence of God, about, can you talk about sin and its effect on people? And I said, well, it's not really an argument for God. Okay, sin isn't really an argument for God, but I will make that effort to kind of look at that. So today I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the effect of sin on, or at least the doctrine of sin, on people who believe in it. Okay, people who have had that preached to them all their life, such as myself, or people like myself who used to preach it from the pulpit. In fact, it's a preaching of the doctrine of sin that was probably the beginning of the end for my faith altogether. Up until that point, up until this point, which I'm going to talk about, I was always wrestling with questions, but I always figured there would be an answer. Like if I addressed a historical question in the Bible, I said, well, the spade of an archaeologist could uncover something very quickly, and we could have new information very soon. It's just that we have never uncovered the information. Of course, I was always wrestling with the question, well, God knows that all these questions are going to be asked, so why doesn't he just provide proof so that the questions are answered? And that, of course, led to a lot of other doubts. But the big thing was people ask me who influenced me as far as atheism. I remember when I was a pastor, I started buying these books. I bought, I bought some stuff by Dawkins, The God Delusion. I bought, I think it was Dennett's book on the New Transparency. I can't remember what it's called. I bought another one, but I bought a couple by Hitchens about religion and how it doesn't do any good. And I bought these things and people would see me reading them and I said, well, I'm just researching. I want to understand atheists better. But the truth was, at the time, I was just full of questions. And I decided to just listen to the atheists. And one of the quotes that I came across was by Dan Barker. And Dan Barker has this quote about sin where he says, sin is a made-up disease. I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was like, sin is a made-up disease and salvation is a made-up solution to a made-up problem, something to that effect. And I happened to be preaching a series on sin and salvation at the time, and I was getting to the sermon on sin. And I'm going to be going over my deconversion story probably over the next 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how long it takes. Again, I want to redo it because I want to add some more elements, but this story will be in there again as well, but I want to tell it here because it's very apropos to the discussion today. Because I was preaching on sin, and this quote from Dan Barker is just going through my head and driving me nuts, because try as I might, as I looked at the text I was preaching from, I couldn't find any proof that sin exists. Now, before everybody jumps all over, but, suffering exists, that's suffering, not sin. Suffering is a result of sin. Death is a result of sin. Being ashamed of our nakedness is a result of sin, okay, according to Christian scriptures, according to Old Testament scripture. Doing, the evil that results from evil actions that people take that are sinful is a result of sin. It's not sin itself. The Bible is very clear, actually, about what sin is. Sin is lawlessness. Sin is a transgression of the law of God. That's the actual definition of sin if you take the Bible itself. Here's the problem. At the time, I already realized that all the arguments for the existence of God, all the philosophical ones, are bogus. Now, I'm going to go over those again in the weeks to come, but I just want to, for the sake of discussion of my history, this is where I was at the time. And I realized that they were all bogus, and that I was trying to come up with a new one, to be honest, because I said none of these work, and there's got to be some other way to prove the existence of God philosophically or empirically, but I couldn't find it. And so I'm wrestling with this question of sin and whether it was real or not. And I'm like, well, I can't use suffering or the results or shame or any of that stuff, because that's the result. That's the A then B. Well, that's the B. All that stuff that most people talk about with sin is the B. It's the results of sin, according to the Bible, not the actual thing. The actual sin is when you defy God's law by disobeying it. So, for instance, Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve, the sin is the actual eating of the apple. That's the actual sin, doing what God tells them not to do. The being ashamed of their nakedness, having their eyes opened, all the suffering in childbirth for women, all this other stuff that follows, mankind becoming evil and thinking about nothing but evil, which is a real impossible thought when you really think about it. And on it goes, are all the results of sin, but they're not the sin itself. The sin itself is when people have a law of God and they disobey it. That's sin itself. Okay, so if the argument, at that moment I began to realize that maybe the Christian God doesn't exist. Okay, I was struggling with that already. But this quote says, okay, well, Jesus is imaginary cure to an imaginary problem. And so I suddenly began, well, is there any empirical evidence for sin outside the Bible that falls along the definition that the Bible gives? And the answer is no. It just doesn't. Okay? There's no scientist out there saying, this proves that disobedience to God is the sin. Nobody's saying that. It's purely made up by the religious figures that wrote the Bible. They made up the concept to explain something, but their explanation doesn't have any grounding in reality. And so I preached that sermon on sin. I sat down in my chair, and our liturgy at the time had my worship leader taking up the offering at that time, okay, and getting up and taking up the offering. I would pray over the offering, then I would sit down and they would actually take up the offering and sing another hymn. And so I'd be sitting in my chair or standing for the hymn for about 5 minutes or so. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, son of a bitch. Dan Barker's right. Sin doesn't really exist. And this whole Jesus thing, this whole dying on a cross, everything, is a made-up solution to a made-up problem. And Ed, here's your problem personally. And this is where it was a hard day for me, because I was like, holy shit, Ed, you preach something that's completely made up. You give them a made-up solution. And in gratitude, they throw their money in the baskets. We were taking up the offering at the time, in order to pay you for this catharsis, this imaginary solution for being the preacher, the bringer of this imaginary solution to an imaginary problem. And it was the doctrine of sin that got me. Began to realize that these doctrines are made up by men. The Bible is written by men. I had already been struggling with the Bible itself as being inspired at the time, and I dismissed that because it's like every definition of inspiration I tried failed, okay, at some point. Plenty of literary, all of them, Catholic, just inspired. Duality was my last one. The Word of God is both a human work and a divine work, but I couldn't prove the divine part. And so I ended up just having a really bad day that day, and that was the beginning of the end. I spent the next year as a deist. I dismissed Christianity, but I kept trying to find, moral things in the Bible to preach from. And then about a year later, I realized that deism is nothing more than religion light. It also makes claims. It just doesn't have a scripture. But if you wrote down what you believe it is a deist, there's your creed, and prove that creed. And And I looked at the creed as I thought it was at the time, couldn't prove that either. So tossed it aside and became an atheist. And so I spent 2 years as an atheist in the pulpit dealing with this sin question and how it affected us negatively. Because I believe that, now here's the real rub for those of us that have deconverted and realize that sin is just bullshit. Okay, it's bullshit. We realize how much of an effect it's had on our life. Okay. I spent 40 some years of my life feeling guilty that I wasn't good enough to appease this imaginary God. That I was worthless because I was a sinner. But if there's no sin, I'm not a sinner. I'm just a human being. And the real problem with a lot of the sins in the Bible is you're just being a flippin' human being, and it's sinful. It's sinful. I mean, I think the best way to illustrate this one is lust and sex, because I had another commenter talk about lust and sex, and talking about, coveting other people's stuff and lust, and, how Jesus gets, and, the commandment of coveting also gets to the idea of if you think it, you're sinning. Okay, and now all of a sudden you can transgress the law of God in your mind, not just in your actions, and therefore you're even more of a flippant sinner. How does anybody escape that? Nobody can escape that. And that's the whole point, is everybody's a sinner. Nobody can escape. And the problem I now have with that is how much guilt and shame that brings for no goddamn good reason. It's imaginary guilt. It's an imaginary cause that we get ashamed of and guilty of. And if you can tell, I'm a little pissed off about this, because my largest problem with the doctrine of sin now is how awful it makes people feel unnecessarily so, simply for being human. Okay, we are human beings, and I'm not going to get into the whole sexual desire. Let's just assume boy meets girl. In fact, I'll use myself. When I was way back dating my ex, when we were both Christians and we were both thinking about going into the ministry and all that jazz, I got back together with her, and we spent a lot of time on the couch fooling around. And eventually it happened. We had sex. And the guilt that came about from that, instead of making that a really positive moment where we connected as two human beings, we were all guilty about trying to keep it hush-hush and nobody could know. And immediately, what did we decide to do? Those of you that have been evangelical Christians, fundamentalist Christians, already know where this is going. Well, I still want to do this some more. We're going to have to get married in order to keep doing this, aren't we? Because that was the guilt trip. The guilt trip is you're engaged in sin, and therefore you're displeasing God, and you should be ashamed of this. You should feel guilty about this. I mean, we were seriously thinking about commitment and being married before this, but now we had to get married. And it was the guilt and the shame that drove us to the altar. That's not a really good way to start a marriage. Okay, somebody could say, well, you could have not done it. And then, yeah, but here's the thing. What I've discovered over the years when it comes to this particular issue of sex, and me and my ex-wife, was one of us was very much interested in it, and the other one was they could take it or leave it, okay, whenever it suited them, or whenever they were in the mood. And yeah, I mean, that's an incompatibility, okay? People have to understand that it's very natural for you to be sexually attracted. If you don't act on it, it doesn't harm anybody, okay? The real issue is consent to me, whether people are going to be safe when they do it. If you're trying to avoid pregnancy, you might want to take steps to do that. But the real, to me, the real issue became the guilt trip about it. And so we're standing up there at the altar getting married, and don't get me wrong, it's a very loving, caring moment. But there was also in the back of both of our minds that once this is over, we can now go get laid and not have to worry about the guilt trip anymore. And even so, even though we did that and we got married, both of us experienced guilt about not waiting for years. Okay, and then finally one day I just got over it. I'm like, well, God hasn't forgiven me by now, then it's not going to happen. I'll be roasting in hell anyway. And, it's those kind of thoughts that lead to other doubts, by the way, because it just doesn't make sense after a while. So, that whole guilt trip thing, and that happens everywhere, like anger. If you get angry, you've murdered him in your heart. And it's like, no, people get pissed off all the time. They get mad all the time. It's a human thing. People do things to us that we don't like, and our response is either push away or run away, fight or flight. And a lot of what is in the Bible that is condoned as sin is fight or flight. Okay? You're fearful, so you deny your faith. Okay? You don't want to die, so you deny your faith. Well, you're a sinner, and God is going to judge you for that. And then you feel guilty about it for the rest of your life, even though you saved your own life, which is finite. Getting angry at somebody, you get the fight refund. Well, you shouldn't be like that. You're getting angry unnecessarily with me, and you need to forgive me. And forgiveness, oh Lord, forgiveness of sin and the way it works, holy cow, does that reinforce a lot of abusive behavior. I mean, I've watched literally people totally be abusive to other people in the church, just making them feel guilty doing stupid stuff. And it'd be like, well, you got to forgive me. And it's like, yeah, because according to the Bible, if you don't forgive your brother, you're going to hell. Your sins won't be forgiven. That's what it says. Jesus says that. Okay, so if I don't forgive somebody, then, I'm doomed. So somebody does absolutely something heinous to me. I mean, I remember trying to counsel like women who had been raped, that you had to forgive your rapist. Like you got to genuinely forgive them. Yeah, work on that. Now I would say, no, you don't have to forgive that son of a bitch. Okay, you can go do, you can be mad at him all you want. Okay, you don't have to like him. You don't necessarily have to forgive him. There's other ways to get past it without forgiveness, by the way. A lot of people say, well, forgiveness is still a good way to move along. It's not so much about forgiveness. It's coming to the realization you didn't do anything wrong, because that's the other guilt trip. A woman, some of these women in some of these denominations, they get sexually assaulted. And what do? What do the religious figures do? Well, you must have done something to deserve that. And I'm like, what? Huh? It's stuff like that you begin to realize once sin is a made-up problem. No, I'm sorry, there's a lot of freedom for me now in just being human. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a heterosexual male, I'm a single bachelor, and my libido is still pretty high. So when I see a good-looking woman walk in front of me and I check her out, yeah, I'm having some thoughts. Okay, but now I look at it that's perfectly normal and very human to do that. And I don't want to creep anybody out, and I'm not trying to say that that's necessarily good, but it's like it's not going to send me to hell. It's not a sin. It's not going to drive me into anything negative. Okay, I can get angry and go, okay, well, maybe anger is the most productive emotion. That's why I follow Stoic philosophy, because anger usually is simply the result of there's something you can't control, and you're trying to control it, and it's just not controllable, and that's why you get angry. So if you learn what you can control and what you can't, then anger often subsides. I don't get near as angry as I used to inside, although being a Stoic and being probably autistic means that I don't really show anger or much emotion anyway. So, that, and by the way, part of the new thing in my deconversion story this time is exploring, okay, how did autism get taken advantage of maybe by religious people, okay? And, how did that play into why my ministries were such failures at times? But this whole idea of sin, when you get rid of it, I suffer from high functioning depression, probably due to the autism. You know, my hypersensitivity gets really going, and then my brain just wants to shut down and I want to quit. And the funny thing is that sin, the idea of sin and being a sinner, reinforces that. I used to have deep bouts of depression when I believed in sin. But from the day I left the pulpit that day and realized sin wasn't real, and I started to struggle with that idea, the more and more I wrestled with it, the more I realized, oh, there's really nothing to be sad about here. I'm just being human. You know, I don't know. It's just freed me up, because the effect of sin is that guilt and shame, and then they ask you to buy the solution, and so you're paying your money. But more than that, it's how it affects your relationships. You know, marriages with that whole authoritarian and man over woman kind of thing. So when the wife doesn't do what she's supposed to and the man tells her to do something, well, you just sinned not just against me, against God. Well, that's a hard rap. Okay, that you just sinned against God. But, you know, the counter now, I'd say, well, why didn't you do what I tell you? You know, and it might be, well, because I'm an equal and you don't get to boss me around. We should be partners in this, you know. And I'm not sure that true partnership is generally always available. I personally think about marriage now, and it's like, I'm still wrestling whether there's a good non-religious reason to get married. Really honest. I mean, everything you can do married, you know, it's really about legalities, and when you really get down to it. And you could go to a lawyer and get that handled without a marriage ceremony, so without a marriage license or any of that crap. That's being me being a very libertarian kind of guy. But yeah, it's just, the more you look at sin and how it affects things negatively, and then you don't believe in it anymore. Like, I don't beat myself up anymore when I check a woman out. I don't plan on, you know, having sex with her or sexually assaulting her or anything like that, but it's just like, oh, nice, you know. And I now accept that as a heterosexual male, I'm going to be attracted to women, okay, sexually. That's part of who we are as a species. And there's nothing wrong with that, but religion wants to make it a sin. So, I mean, come on, sexual desire for prosperity are probably the two greatest desires. And so if you build, oh, you're being greedy, okay, or you get angry at somebody, oh, you're being angry, you're sinning. I mean, think about how common sexual desire, anger, and desire for a better life are among every human being. And then you take all those good desires, which aren't necessarily bad or good, and then you turn them around and say they're sinful, and now how do you escape being human? And so you can't escape being human, so you can't escape being sinful, because they've made up a doctrine in such a way and created a thing of sin so in such a way that you can't escape it. And then they sell you an imaginary solution to appease your guilt. And then they go after you in other ways. Like, man, I lost track of the number of ministers who bought into the whole, you know, I'm God's anointed bullshit. And then, you know, would push that on their congregations, like, you have to obey me because I'm God's anointed. I mean, cults are started this way. It's the shame, the guilt, the whatever, you know, and you get rid of all that. And here's the positive. It's really hard to be manipulated. When somebody comes along to you and says you're doing something wrong, and you say, no, I'm just being human. Okay, I'm just being a human being. When you get to that point, there's a lot of liberation in that. And I've gotten to that point in my deconversion where people, you know, say, well, you shouldn't be looking at somebody that way, or you shouldn't be angry about this, or you shouldn't be, you know, pursuing X because it's greedy or whatever. And it's like, I don't buy any of that. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there's rules to human society, and then we need to find out what they are and follow them. You know, lust, you know, but does lust exist, or is it a religious word now, becomes my question. I haven't answered that question, but it's a question that doubts my mind. I'd rather just say sexual desire, okay, because it's far more common. And so my thing with sin is, the way it negatively affects us is it puts you into that emotional state of guilt and shame. And it's like I've said before, I think I said it last week, when somebody puts you into that emotional state, a heightened emotional state. So when the preacher gets up there and preaches sin and salvation, like I did the day I realized it was garbage, the real motivation is for him to make you feel guilty and ashamed for your sins so that you will buy the solution that he's selling. Now, before we harp on ministers, remember, as somebody who used to be a minister, I was a sincere believer that that's what was the right thing to do and that was the truth. And I don't think that's being deceptive, but what began to rub me wrong, what made my deconversion so difficult as a minister, because I was still in the pulpit, was how do I preach that now? Okay, and I know that some of you are ministers out there watching this. How do you do that now? Now, if you know that the doctrine of sin is made up and the solution is made up, how do you preach both of those things now with a good conscience and not think of yourself as a charlatan and a fraud? And for 3 years, I got into the damn pulpit avoiding those two topics because I did not want to be a fraud. I had developed a conscience, a real one. And I did not want to preach garbage and talk about garbage. So I would go to the parts of the Bible that were more moral. I would talk about, commandments of God and, zip into morality, whatever. But I wouldn't try to make anybody feel guilty or ashamed about who they were. I talked a lot more about the common humanity that we all shared. And that was the beginning. I mean, but still, you can only skirt around the issue so many times. And it just became wearying and stressful and everything else. And I was in a stressful state and I had an affair, an emotional one, mostly texting back and forth and a few naughty pictures. But it's just what led me into that emotional state and made me vulnerable was the struggle with realizing what I was and who I was completely gone because of a realization that sin was not real. And that the solution for sin was also thus not real. And I was preaching imaginary things to make a buck. And if you're an honest person at that point, and that's your honest assessment, how do you keep doing that? And not have an attack of conscience every time you hit the pulpit. And that's where I was. So I can tell you the effect of sin personally, and I can also tell you the liberation of it since leaving the church. People ask, when's the last time you were in a church? I was in a church for somebody's 50th wedding anniversary, but that's been it. I've not gone into his church for a religious service since end of May 2018. Haven't done it. So that's 5 years, slightly over 5 years now. And I never will, because I refuse to be a part of something that's designed to bring shame and guilt on people, to manipulate them, to put money in the basket or control them or get them to look at their relationships a certain way or feel guilty about something as natural as making love. I'm not going to do that anymore, and I won't be a part of it anymore. And so, I'm honest, if nothing else. Okay, I spent 3 years being dishonest, and I'm trying to make up for it. I really am. I think that's all I want to talk about today. I have a few comments, but this is kind of getting close to a half hour, and I want to kind of wrap it up. Just so you know, I'm going to continue my series on the arguments for the existence of God, but I'm also going to start doing my deconversion story again. I think it's probably going to end up being 3-parters because I got to deep dive a little bit on a few other issues now, looking back. So those are the things that are coming up. Tune in next week, same time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was originally going to do these 11, but I think, I want to be around to answer comments and questions on a premiere. So it's going to continue to be 3 o'clock on Sundays. So thank you very much for stopping by. I appreciate every single one of you. Like, share, subscribe, get your notification bell, comment below. Everything you do helps the channel. We're getting very, very close. I think I looked today, I have 945 subscribers, so we're only 55 away from 1,000. And, keep sharing this with your friends, your atheist friends. I can always use, we're trying to build a different type of atheist community here that's more about civility and discussion and things like that, even with believers. So thank you for being supportive of that. The big issue these days for the other things that involve, like membership and, ad revenue from YouTube, ad and subscriber revenue is simply watch hours. And we're constantly, as I do new videos, climbing. So thank you very much for stopping by. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you watching videos to the end, because all of that helps our watch hours and everything else. So thank you very much. Well, I'm going to wish you a great day. Live your best life. You only get one, so make it a good one. And I want to wish all of you a great day, and I am going to see you all next time.